The more significant issue here is not just that all this additional consumer credit and debt is indicative of a weak economy. It's also indicative that the Fed is losing its battle against inflation because the Fed has to rein in credit. The Fed has to raise interest rates in order to restrict credit. That's the purpose of these rate hikes. Again, what the Fed needs to do is discourage people from spending and encourage people to save. That's the purpose of these rising interest rates. But that's not happening. The Fed is raising interest rates, but consumers don't care. They're just borrowing more money and spending more money. So this credit supply is expanding, and that's going to continue to put upward pressure on prices. The Fed is making no real headway in its battle against inflation. All that we've seen is a temporary correction in commodity prices, a downturn in house prices, but beneath the surface, the inflationary forces are as strong as ever. In fact, they're getting stronger. And so all these people who are expecting a meaningful reduction in the inflation rate in 2023 aren't going to get what they expect. After a brief downturn in the official numbers, we're going to see a surge as consumers continue to spend borrowed money, but more importantly, as the dollar tanks, putting huge upward pressure not only on commodities, causing a reversal and a run to new highs, but on the record level of imports, because everything America buys, and of course most of the stuff, the merchandise that we buy is made abroad, all that stuff is going to get a lot more expensive as the dollar falls. And the other reason, of course, that people think that inflation may come down in 2023 is they think the unemployment rate will go up. And they expect a rise in unemployment to bring down inflation. In fact, many people still think that's the Fed's goal, that the Fed's plan is to fight inflation by fighting employment, by causing an increase in unemployment, by causing a slowdown at the rate at which wages are rising. People think that rising wages cause inflation, and so the Fed needs to slow down wage growth with its rate hikes. But rising wages don't cause inflation. In fact, looking at wages going up and concluding that's the reason for inflation is like somebody who's sick and they have a fever, and so they take their temperature with a thermometer, and then the thermometer says 102, and they blame their fever on the thermometer. Well, it's not the thermometer's fault. It's just reflecting your temperature. Well, that's the same thing with wages. Rising wages aren't causing inflation. Inflation is causing wages to rise. So the wages are simply taking the economy's temperature when it comes to inflation. Now, you can't fight inflation by trying to stop wages from going up. That would be like trying to fight your fever by smashing your thermometer, or maybe lowering the reading by putting the thermometer in a cup of ice water. That's not going to work. If you ignore the underlying illness and just try to cover up the symptoms or deny they're there, then you're going to get sicker. The same thing is going to happen with inflation. If the Fed is thinking that rising wages are the problem and it tries to solve that or cover that up, then the underlying actual problem that is causing wages to go up is going to continue, and that's inflation. And in fact, the reality is, to the extent that the Fed does succeed in putting people out of work, that is actually going to be inflationary, because people are going to stop working, but they're not going to stop spending. They're going to continue to have access to money either through the government or through credit cards, and they're going to keep on spending, fueling demand, but they're not going to be producing, and so you get less supply of goods and services and you get more demand. What the Fed really wants to do with employment is maintain it. In fact, we need more people productively employed, not fewer. It's just that the people who are employed have to stop spending their paychecks. They have to take more of their paychecks and put it in the bank, pay off their credit card debt. That's what they have to do. If people remain employed but stop spending, that's great, because that means they're still working, they're still productive, so we have more supply, but we have a reduction in demand because they're not spending every nickel they make and then borrowing even more than that. We want consumers to pay back what they borrowed, to spend less than they make, and save the difference. But none of that is happening. And that just indicates that despite all this wishful thinking and happy talk on Wall Street, the Fed is making no progress in the fight against inflation. Inflation is winning that fight, and it's only a matter of time until the Fed surrenders. But I want to change gears slightly and talk a little politics. The 15th time was the charm for Kevin McCarthy to become the Speaker of the House of Representatives, the third highest office in the land, because the Speaker of the House is 2 heartbeats away from the presidency of the United States. And it was a big drama because there was a group of conservative Republican holdouts that didn't want to immediately vote for the confirmation of Kevin McCarthy. So it took 15 votes to put him over the top. Of course, the Democrats were unified every time. They all voted for the same candidate. In fact, I forget who that candidate was, but it was irrelevant because the Democrats knew that who they were voting for was going to lose, so it didn't matter. So there was no reason not to be unified, so they could try to compare themselves to the Republican Party and say, hey, we're all unified, and these guys are all over the place. They can't get their act together. Look how much division there is within the Republican Party, and we don't have that kind of division. We've all come together, and we've unified around the same candidate. Yes, it's easy to unify around a candidate that everybody knows is going to lose because it doesn't matter. What the Democrats were more concerned about was making a point, and in trying to make the Republicans look bad because they couldn't unify around a candidate who was going to win the way they could unify around a candidate who was guaranteed to lose. But a lot of people in the Republican Party were probably upset that the party looked bad, and they had hoped that all of these Republicans would just fall into line. After all, McCarthy had almost all the votes, and it was only a small fraction of the Republicans that wanted somebody else. And I don't know to what extent they really wanted somebody else, although if they had a choice in the matter, they probably would have gone with somebody else, but they didn't have the votes. But what they tried to do was leverage their political power to try to get some concessions from McCarthy, and ultimately they won. They got the concessions that they wanted, and so I think it is a win for the Republican Party, although it may be a victory in name only because it remains to be seen whether anything is actually going to be accomplished. One of the main reasons that these Republicans were trying to exact these concessions was to slow down the growth of government spending, or maybe even reduce government spending. This is particularly important in the aftermath of that $1.7 trillion reconciliation bill that was crammed down everybody's throats in the House last minute. This is not the way legislation is supposed to be made. In fact, we shouldn't even allow this type of spending. I personally think that any time the government wants to spend money, that particular program should be separate from every other program, so each member of the House has to vote up or down on each item of spending. What I don't like is when you cram all the spending into one big bill and then it's a take it or leave it. Either you agree to all this pork barrel legislation or the entire government gets shut down. And what happens is every member of Congress who has its own favorite piece of pork, they just throw it all in there. And it's just one big pork stew, and everybody has to drink it because it's either all or nothing. It would be much better if each government spending bill had to stand on its own, and we made each representative have to cast a vote up or down to spend that money. Because if we did it that way, there would be a lot less spending because a lot of these bills would not be able to get the support to pass, which would be a good thing. But when they take a lot of spending that never would pass and they shove it in as part of this massive bill that nobody has a chance to read, and if you don't vote for it, the whole government shuts down, that is a recipe for disaster because the government is on autopilot for more and more spending.